I've been asked to talk about supply and demand, and I'm going to mainly talk about supply because I think some of the lists that Linda's going to be coming up with in the future as we go forward in the next couple of years, that's really going to dictate and also give us the information that we need to be able to put the right trees in our catalogue. Bruce, I apologise that we've got a poplar, not a willow, on the front.
I've noticed.
And so actually being a speaker a little later in the afternoon's been quite good because I could have been tripped up a few times along the way. I'm certainly not an expert in suitable trees for bees, that's why I'm here, but we grow around about 500 species. In our catalogue, we've grown well in excess of 1,200 species, and so really the demand is going to be heavily dictated with trees for bees by the work that Linda and other people are doing. So I thought today I'd talk a little bit more about about the supply side of things, because really the customers, it's what they purchase from our catalogue, it's the trees that we throw away at the end of a season that we weren't able to sell that dictates what we tend to grow. So things, as you will all know, the fashions in gardening and tree plantings tend to change. We're both an exotic and a native plant nursery, but certainly there's been a very heavy emphasis back towards natives or towards natives full stop. But anyway, I'll give you a little bit of a showcase about the things that people need to think about. Obviously, Comvita is very heavily into the propagation of clones and varieties, and that really can be put over a whole range of well in excess of 1,200 species. So there's some pretty good work to be done out there. So really, for us, it starts at this time of the year. That is Prunus avium. And certainly the weediness issue of exotic trees has been covered, and I'll maybe make some comments as we go along because I think that can be managed. This is Prunus avium. We collect, since we've established, it's a family-owned nursery, my father and myself. We've been in partnership for 30 years, and so over that time you gain quite a lot of knowledge about improved provenances or a line of seed that does particularly well. This is a Prunus avium that grows wild in the riverbeds of mid-Canterbury, around the Oxford area. Really interesting that particular line of trees suffers from very little virus issues. In fact, it's wonderful. If I was to go and collect seed out of an orchard, out of a producing orchard, I'd have a lot of virus issues. That's a wild collected. It can be deemed that it's a weedy species. There's a lot of blackbirds and a lot of other things rely on this as a food source. There's timber trees that are large enough for timber in there, and I would imagine in the spring there'd be a lot of nectar and pollen when they're flowering. So, next one. So we've collected it in the wild, we've brought it back to the nursery, we're doing a floating test there just to separate. Next one. Across the range of species we grow, we have all sorts of challenges. This is Magnolia solangiana, and later on I'll show you some pictures of the flowering of magnolia. In my choice here, I'm not really putting any emphasis towards trees that are necessary, suitable for bees, but just giving you a little bit of an idea of the challenges or the things that we need to think about as we're going forward. So the interesting thing is that we can't necessarily assume that a tree, things change. I've been collecting Magnolia solangiana out at the Botanic Gardens Christchurch, where they have a particularly large grove of them. The blackbirds were always the first birds that were in collecting the fruit. Obviously, the fruit is transported, the fruit is cleansed through the bird, transported and dropped. I've never seen Magnolia solangiana as a weedy species, so as Linda was alluding to, we can start to make some assumptions, particularly in a botanical gardens that's over 100 years of age, or Eastwoodhill. The really interesting thing is in the last 3 to 4 years, the wood pigeons have learnt to come in and collect the magnolia fruit. So, yeah, things do change. Once they're cleaned, we paint treat the seed to stop the mice and rats eating it over the winter, so that'll be sown very shortly. Some of the challenges is that we also work with conifers. Now, obviously, that's of no interest, but just really showing the diversity across seed. And so we're climbing trees and collecting the cones at this time of the year. Common pear, Pyrus communis. Linda alluded to the fact that we can use seedling fruit trees to create not only pollen and nectar, but also for riparian strip planting, for animal shade and things such as that. So that's just, we simply collected pears from an orchard. We don't have any virus issues with that particular line, and so we're just cleaning that seed down. Kowai. Interesting that kowai is not necessarily a good plant to use, but that's kowai that's collected. It's a local provenance. And there we are, scarifying the seed with some sandpaper. That's just to initiate. That's exactly the same treatment as the seed would receive if it was in a river system, tumbling down and then subsequently germinating. Locally across the top of the South Island, kowai are really in decline, so it's still a good plant to see being planted. Right, this is really just to illustrate how once we've made the selections of a particular tree, we can bulk that up. So we may be talking of numbers of 5 to 1,000 or maybe 300,000 or 400,000 plants. And I'll just illustrate, other than Pinus radiata, how we can achieve that. This is just a shot in the nursery where we're using sawdust to cover the seed beds. And from that, we can mechanise all the root trimming, the lifting, exactly as if it was a crop of Pinus radiata. Obviously, environmental issues. You've got birds, wind, and frost, and also sun scorch. So in that case, we're covering the seed beds. Now, there's a good comparison. This is on our forestry tree nursery. So we've got Pinus radiata, Douglas fir out to the left, and ginkgo bilobium in the right. So a 1-year-old crop of radiata and 2-year-old crops of ginkgo. At our ornamental nursery, we've got, as I said in their catalogue, a range of maybe in excess of 500 species. And we've got cornus, magnolias, and pyrus. So both the cornus and the pyrus obviously have opportunities for bees. Maples, there was comments made about maples. Certainly sycamore and, anything that you have the ability for birds to carry, plants to climb, such as your climbing species, and some of the winged seed species are the ones that maybe we need to look at some weediness. But that just gives you an idea of the diversity, both 1- and 2-year-old. And everything we see here is actually bare root lifted, so it's lifted during the winter dormant period. That's just another view of ginkgo germinating. So, in the case there's around about 200,000 plants there, so things can be bulked up once we understand what the demand is. Things can be bulked up and grown on a pretty large scale. Clonal redwoods, so now we're talking about, once we move away from seed, we're thinking about the use of cuttings, grafting, or maybe tissue culture. So that's clonal redwoods, and obviously for land stability, redwoods are wonderful for that. And by choosing in the same way that the Manuka clones have been, we're talking around about a 50 to 100% gain in growth potential, form, so the significant benefits. Okay, so here we're looking at Acer rubrum. Interesting that some tree species, we just really don't want to be grafting them. We want to be growing them on their roots, where grafting, you can end up with grafting incompatibility. Our work with Eastwoodhill is, in a lot of cases, is bringing back some of these older trees, trees that are quite decrepit. If we can possibly put them on their own roots and avoid graft incompatibility, there's a certain benefit. And once again, we can lift that. Once we know what we really want, we can lift that production significantly. And with that comes scale, and with that, the price is reduced. So, This is an upside down photograph. Not so much that it's upside down, but the pottle is upside down. This is growing plants from tissue culture. When we're talking about importation of plants, tissue culture is almost, in some cases, the only way that we can deal with some of the biosecurity issues. So that just gives you an illustration that has been started from an absolutely tiny, tiny, tiny cutting, and those plants are now ready. The next photo will show those plants brought out of the flask. They've been growing in an algae medium, and those are ready to be propagated and grown on. Okay, this one's upside down, but this gives you a little bit of an idea across the colour range of Magnolia solangiana. This was really just an example of how, from a seedling line, we can go out and select, and it's been really covered pretty well by Comvita, so we'll just move on. You know, if you get a nice seedling line, you can pretty much guarantee good flowering, lots of flowers, and by growing from seedlings, it is a more cost efficient than growing from cuttings, although if you're growing in large numbers of cuttings, you can get the cost down, certainly. Yep. Right, Robinia. Now, there hasn't been... One of the things with Robinia is that it has been deemed to be a difficult to grow plant in regard to the form. It's prone to wind, but this was a seedling selection, a couple of seedling selections I've made myself, where just the sheer amount of flowering, just huge amounts of flowers. A little prone to suckering, however, if suckering is what you need for erosion control, then there are benefits from that. And you can see a bit of a pink form there. And time of flowering. That's a seedling line of a prunus, and you can see how dramatically different across those are. So if you're choosing for continuous flowering, then and in fact all three of those flower, but you can just see that's a very early spring shot. Next one. Right, here's a good example of mixing natives with exotics, because some people don't like mixing natives with exotics. You know, you can add colour, you can, yeah, all plants are doing something in that shot. Okay, on my own property, of course, coming to Eastwoodhill for 25 years, it tends to rub off. So this is really just a bit of an example of what we've been doing. As a nursery, it's really important that we understand our trees, and we also understand how well they do, and also an opportunity to trial. So the last 4 shots before I finish is just really an illustration of, this is a property that's 6 kilometres east of Wakefield, which is 25 k's south of Nelson City. So this is not clay country, this is dry, a little bit like the East Coast Canterbury. It's quite free draining, and on it I've planted 1,000 different species, and in some cases I've got up to 10 and 12 different provenances that I've selected from different areas and brought them all together, and it's an opportunity to trial and gain some knowledge, mainly so we can help our customers.